So, as you've heard, I am Dr. Kate Bulinski. I teach in the Department of Environmental Studies at Bellarmine University. I am a geologist, but my specialty area is paleontology, which is why we have a fossil up here on the screen. To tell you a little bit more about myself, just so you have some context for what you're going to be hearing about today. I have my undergrad is at Penn State, my graduate degree, my doctorate is from University of Cincinnati, but I've been at Bellarmine now, this is my 14th year. And I've been interested in the topic of faith and science for quite some time now. As you can see on the picture on the bottom left, I was on the cover of Bellarmine magazine, which is like the alumni magazine, highlighting my connections with faith and reason. And this dates back to 2010, so this is more than 10 years ago now that I've been interested in the topic of faith and science. Because back then I was teaching a first-year seminar on evolution and creationism. So this has been something that I've been exploring through my teaching for some time now. I'm also a practicing Catholic and attend St. Agnes Parish. And the deacon who served at Mass tonight is my husband, Deacon Ned Berghausen. He's a theology teacher at Assumption. And then we have 4 children, the tiny ones that you heard about, a 5-year-old named EJ, and then 2-year-old triplets, Max, Miriam, and Petra. So we have a lot going on in our house, more than just faith and science. But anyhow, I want to talk to you about some of the ways that I see faith being compatible and complementary. So part of what I'm bringing here tonight is some of the things that I've observed in my classroom, some of the misconceptions that I've seen students bring with them about faith and about science and about how they either are compatible or aren't compatible. Popular culture paints them oftentimes as incompatible for various reasons. Some of it is because there's a lot of misinformation about science and how science works. And also certain religious traditions do have some problems with science. They reject scientific evidence outright. And for whatever reason, religious traditions are often painted with that broad brush of being seen as incompatible, when in fact, most mainline religious traditions do not have conflict between faith and science. So how can we make sense then of the relationship between faith and science as Catholics? And that's what I want to talk about tonight. So science and faith present different ways of knowing about our world, different methodologies for approaching truth. And we heard about that in the homily tonight. Science is based on gathering data and making observations and drawing conclusions from that. And so science is a methodology for answering questions about how the world works. Now, faith also addresses questions, but approaching it from a different angle, transcending what can be tested through scientific procedures, rather using theology and philosophy to address questions related to why the world is the way it is, addressing questions relating to purpose and meaning and ethics. So it is another way of approaching knowledge and truth, but from a different methodology. So to delve a little bit deeper, science involves experimentation and observation. Science is a methodology that works on the premise that we can explore the world around us by gathering information. We can run experiments, we can run the experiments again. Repeatable, testable ideas. We can make observations about the natural world and gather information that way. And then we do things with those data. We interpret them and we draw conclusions from it. So we can do statistical analysis to understand the results, to understand how reliable and how much we can trust those results. We can run additional tests and additional experiments to gain more knowledge about it, to refine our understanding, and then make assessments on the results based on what is known. But we have to be humble as scientists, and we heard about humility in the homily tonight as well, because there's limitations to the methodology of science. We need to always remember what we do not yet know, that we do not have all the answers yet, And so we need to think about what is the level of uncertainty about the results that we have. What do we still need to study in the future? What were the limitations of the studies that were done? And recognize that there are aspects of the world that we may never uncover. So in my field of paleontology, there are creatures that lived on this planet that were never ever preserved, and we will never know about them ever. So we need to recognize that sometimes there are going to be gaps in knowledge, and we need to work within that system. Now, faith works with the methodology of theology. And theology is the process of applying reason to revelation. And so what is that? Well, revelation is God revealing himself to humanity. And there's different ways in which that happens. There's natural revelation, knowledge of the divine obtained through the experience of nature. And then divine revelation, knowledge of the divine obtained through Scripture. And so we can acquire knowledge, understand truth through theological and philosophical methods. And so there's different ways to do that. Just to give you a couple of examples, there's systematic theology, where we are developing an integrated understanding of the doctrines of the church in combination with our understanding of Scripture. There's also historical theology, where we understand our faith through a historical critical lens, to think about the history of civilization and how that connects to our church fathers and the times that Scripture was written. So understanding more about our faith through these methods. But we also have to be humble. We have to think about what is not yet known, that we don't know God's full purpose for us and for the world. And we're still learning about Scripture and doctrine through text and history. We don't know everything. And there's some aspects of our existential reality that we may never uncover. So let me grab a drink of water real quick. Been yapping for a minute. So one of the ways that I find helpful for understanding the relationship between faith and science is by looking at different models of how they might integrate or actually be in conflict. And one of the best sources I've found for this is the book Religion and Science by Dr. Ian Barber, who was a scholar of religion and science. And he had presented 4 models for how science and faith interact in this book. They are namely conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration, and I'm going to talk more about each of these now. So the first model here is conflict, and this is what is often brought up in the media as sort of the sensational conflict between faith and science, and isn't necessarily how a lot of people view this topic. But just to elaborate, there's sort of 2 extremes of this spectrum. There's scientific materialism, or scientism. In this idea, the scientific method would be the only way to obtain knowledge about the universe, and that matter is the ultimate reality, and that you could reduce everything in the known universe to the realm of chemistry and physics, and there's no room for anything beyond that. So that's one extreme. Another extreme on this is biblical literalism, otherwise known as fundamentalism. And in this view, Scripture is inerrant in a literal sense. So you would be using Scripture or a particular translation of Scripture word for word as the way that things are. And that if there's any scientific evidence that is in conflict with Scripture, the scientific evidence must be rejected as false. And these are beliefs that are held by certain denominations, but not Catholics. This is not in alignment with Catholic teaching, I should say. And so this is not what the Catholic Church teaches about faith and science, to be clear. The second model is known as independence. And this is where faith and science are considered as separate spheres of human experience. They kind of operate in their own silos. So for science, in this model, it asks and addresses questions of how the world works. But science is constrained only to asking questions about the natural world and doesn't get extra input from the realm of faith and science, the realm of faith and ethics and so forth. Now, also in this model for faith, asking and addressing questions of why, it's neither supported or threatened by science. It kind of operates in its own bubble. And there are philosophical concerns related to purpose and meaning and existence and ethics that are addressed here, but there's no talking to the realm of science. There's no dialogue happening here. So that brings us to, I should say that Catholics don't view it this way. We don't compartmentalize faith and science this way. So the next model, which was what I was getting to, is dialogue. That science and faith can actually complement each other, that they're actually talking to each other and gaining understanding through a kind of iterative discussion. So we recognize in this model that in our culture, in our society, there are shifting paradigms of thought that we as human beings gain knowledge and understanding about the world that involves both our science and our faith. And so the phenomena of science and faith can be more wholly understood when we are examining it in relationship to each other. This works because we have to recognize that science is not, as much as we want it to be, a purely objective act because human beings do it. And so we require imagination and creativity and ingenuity to think of hypotheses and to come up with ideas for doing science. And so we require inspiration and we draw from what we see in the natural world. And so to give you a few examples of where dialogue comes into play, we can think about medical ethics, environmental ethics, that when we are uncovering new ways of curing diseases, we need to think about the ethical implications of that. And so you can see where faith and ethics can actually inform the decision-making of how we apply our science. Same with environmental ethics, understanding the technologies that we use and how they impact the environment and thinking about the ethics of whether and should we should use that technology or not. Just because we can doesn't mean that we should. Other examples, exploration of the human body and spirit. So here's an example actually from the Buddhist tradition. The Dalai Lama has expressed interest in recent years in neuroscience and thinking about what the process of prayer and meditation actually does with the human brain. And so thinking about what that means is a way of showing the dialogue between science and faith. And then another example, thinking about natural disasters. These are events that are explained by science, but there are religious implications of them. Thinking about the problem of evil, for example, or thinking about the consequences of natural disasters and how we care for people that may be in harm's way or affected by them or vulnerable to disasters. So these are places where we see dialogue and ways that science can enhance faith and faith can enhance science. The fourth model is integration, and it's a bit more connected, where science and faith are working together for a holistic view of reality. So there are models for how integration works, and these get a little technical, but I'll try to explain them briefly. There's one model called natural theology, and it's the idea that the existence of God can be inferred by studying the natural world. So in the idea of design, that there are laws of nature and patterns and processes that are here that are a sign of the special creation of the universe. There's the idea of the first cause, that we can infer that God exists because there must have been a cause for all of known reality. Or the Anthropic Principle, which is the idea that the universe is, and our solar system and our Earth is just the right set of conditions for supporting life as we know it. It's as if the universe is kind of tuned for supporting life, kind of the sweet spot, if you will. Another model is the Theology of Nature, that science can inform how theology actually integrates with the natural world So to give two brief examples, there's the idea of teleology, which is the unfolding through evolution of all of creation, and that we, created in the image of God, are also a part of that. So where does that fit in? Understanding our place in the natural tree of life, but also our place as specially created by God. There's also the idea of environmental ethics. So we are called to care for creation, but we also are affecting creation. And so how can our understanding through science and our understanding through theology work together for caring for creation? And then the third model here is systematic synthesis, that science and religion contribute to a holistic understanding of our relationship within, so as a part of the natural world, and within the natural world as a part of our special creation from God. So in this sense, science and faith together are more than the sum of its parts. They really do contribute to something, a much greater understanding of truth. So where does Catholicism fit into this? Really, it is the dialogue and integration models. Both of them are ways that we see our Catholic teaching demonstrating the connections between science and faith, of back and forth, informing each other, but also working together to show a more full picture of our ultimate reality. So in my view, science and faith are both compatible and they are complementary. We can draw upon ethics and morality for informing our scientific work. We can draw from purpose, meaning, and understanding from our faith to drive our inspiration to do the scientific work that we do. And really both science and faith contribute to awe and wonder of this beautiful world that we live in. And so I want to leave you with one last thing. So if you're interested in this topic of faith and science, I encourage you to actually dig into an encyclical called Fides et Ratio, which is Faith and Reason. It was written by St. John Paul II in 1998. And it begins with this beautiful passage that I think exemplifies so much of what we've been talking about tonight. Faith and reason are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth. In a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. Thank you.
So both Archbishop Kurtz and Professor Bulinski noted how, as Archbishop Kurtz put it, faith and science are often viewed in our culture as two entities that aren't speaking to each other. I believe that's the term that you used.
On speaking terms.
Yeah, not on speaking terms. So I want to toss in for here a little bit different perspective. So I'm a scientist by training, but I'm happy to be at the current point in my life that I'm working with the Vatican Observatory. And what brought me in with the Vatican Observatory turns out to be research and work that I've done in the history of science. Okay, and while stereotypes exist, and we can't get away from that. Okay, the history of faith and science is surprisingly if you're a person who has learned a lot of stereotypes, interesting and dynamic and cool, and the sort of thing that makes you actually really want to learn more about your Catholic faith. All right. So my experience is that when the subject is faith and science, there are three big areas that all that have historical roots to them, that people will sort of get stuck on and go to the stereotypes, and maybe say to Archbishop Kurtz or Professor Bulinski, hey, wait, but what about blank? Okay, and these three things are Galileo, right? Darwin, and space aliens. Okay, those are the things. Okay, what about Galileo? What about evolution? And, well, what if we're not alone and there's other stuff? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, I'm only to provide a slight response here to what's been said, but I can tell you that from a historical perspective, for example, there never was a situation where, for example, people refused to look through a telescope, right, and see for themselves that the earth went around the sun because of what it said in the Bible, all right? That did not happen, okay? I don't mean that somewhere somebody didn't do that, okay, that some ignorant soul said, no, I won't look through that. But from the standpoint of did the church, did an informed person, and so on and so forth, not just like Joe Blow, who did that occur? No, okay? And generally not in Darwin and not in space aliens. And really that the history and the story of all those things, they're too complex to go into here. But that there's just a lot that's really interesting. So that what about that somebody might have, they heard this talk and said, oh, that sounds really good, but what about Galileo? Okay, well, I encourage you, read history, dig in deep, don't go with the stereotypes, and you'll learn a lot of stuff. And by and large, it's not all, the church is a human institution. We've done a lot of stupid stuff, okay? But by and large, it's a really cool and interesting story, and I encourage you to learn more about it.
Thank you. I am Deacon Ned Berghausen, a permanent deacon here in the Archdiocese of Louisville, and as you heard, the husband of a scientist, which does not make me a scientist. My dad's also a surgeon, which does not, give me good knowledge of how to do surgery. So, but I am very interested in the compatibility of these two fields, and part of that is my role as a high school theology teacher. One of the things that research has found, and also anecdotally I've seen, is that believing this conflict model is one of the things that drives young people, and some old people too, away from the church. The idea that you cannot be a faith-filled Christian who is also a person that accepts the truths of science. And that's really disturbing because the church is one of the great pioneers of science. And so there are several of us that are a part of a dialogue group that you've heard about, who are science and theology teachers who've come together to find ways to kind of combat this. We have Holly McGuire from Trinity and Pat Burton and Carrie Sims from Mercy, and I'm a high school teacher at Assumption. And a number of us have done some programs up at Notre Dame to kind of combat these ideas too. So these misconceptions. So one of the things though that I like to think about that sort of idea that there's a incompatibility. My students ask me that, what do you think about science? I say, well, I'd have a really hard time if they're incompatible. My wife and I really wouldn't have much to talk about if that was the case. But I've found just within our own relationship that this spirit of both dialogue as we began dating and then integration, both as people and in terms of exploring ideas, has just been a really rich part of our lives together. One of the things we really enjoy doing is traveling. And especially early in our relationship, she would drag me to natural history museums, and she'd show me an impressive statue or fossil, like Sioux up in the Field Museum in Chicago, and I'd do a goofy pose in front of it. And then I'd take her to a beautiful church, and we'd go to Mass together. And one of my favorite examples of this, on our honeymoon, we went on a pilgrimage to Rome. And we were in the Vatican Museum, and we came across this beautiful sarcophagus. And Kate just is so interested as a geologist in rocks. And she went up to it and she went, oh, look at this beautiful marble. This is called porphyry. It's purple. It's just the most exquisite. I can tell you about the place where it is mined in Egypt. I went there as an undergrad. And she kept rhapsodizing. And I stopped her and I said, yeah, that rock is really nice. This is also the tomb of Saint Helena. the mother of Saint Constantine, one of the greatest saints of the church. So it's good. Our relationship's been good for lots of enrichment and for laughs. And Kate left you with a quote from John Paul II. I'd like to give you another one as well. This is a letter that he wrote to the director of the Vatican Observatory. And he wrote, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw from the other a wider world, a world in which both can flourish."
Oh, good.